We love our animals, but we don't necessarily provide them optimal welfare, but we love them, so that's enough. And it isn't. And we need to be distinguishing between loving our horse and making sure we bring him in when it's raining a little bit and actually thinking, horse doesn't mind rain, let's leave it out there.
Welcome to Changing Rein. We are very excited this week to introduce our guest, Georgina Groves. So Georgina has a really long history working in animal welfare and particularly in zoos. And I'm going to let her explain a little bit more about what she's done in the past. But recently, Georgina wrote a really interesting post on LinkedIn about practices of caring for animals and what we know about animal welfare and comparing that to what we do.
And I should mention, Georgina is a horse owner and rider, so she understands the challenges faced by horse owners.
So I think that fits in beautifully for season 6 of Changing Rein. Welcome, Georgina. We're so thrilled that you are with us today.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation.
Our pleasure. So before we start off, would you like to just give the elevator pitch of what you've done in around animal welfare throughout your career?
Sure, yes. It's quite a sort of long, convoluted, I suppose, description of my career to date, really. But I started off as a zoology student. And then I started off as a wildlife campaigner for a large international animal welfare organisation. And that brought me into sort of the wildlife arena where I was looking at the bear trade, which sort of brought to my attention. There was a gap in the space in terms of animal welfare and what people were doing. And this was mostly because of the tension perhaps between the animal welfare community and the zoo community itself, and where the zoo community thought the animal welfare community were antagonistic towards them, and the animal welfare community felt that the zoo community weren't doing enough. And so through that, I helped co-found an organisation called Wild Welfare, where we wanted to create a platform for both sides, so to speak, having space to meet and talk constructively and ruminate over ideas, because we felt that there was a lot of sort of similarities between how they both thought, but they were coming at it from very different places. World welfare then set me on this sort of very quick trajectory of looking at zoo animal welfare around the world and trying to support and build capacity and empower people to provide better welfare in zoos in South America, Southeast Asia, all these different countries that currently lack perhaps very good animal welfare. And then through that, I have also carried out work in other areas, not just zoo welfare, but in farm animal welfare, in pet animal welfare. But in particular, I've always been drawn back to that captive exotic animal welfare space. I think it's just a really exciting area, and one that is underrepresented still, despite there being millions of captive wild animals around the world, whether that's in zoos, whether that's in cafes, exotic cafes, which I'll probably talk about later, or even as pets. So it's a really interesting and I think often underrepresented space. And that's really it, very quickly in a nutshell.
And you brought up one of the key things that drew me to reaching out to you to come on to Changing Rein, and that's that gap between knowledge and practice. It's something that I think is a challenge for all of us, and particularly it applies to the horse space as well as the zoo animal space, and we were really keen to bring different perspectives and see if that can help us move the conversation forward and give people different perspectives. So you described that there's a persistent disconnect between what we know about animals and what we choose to act upon. So can you talk a bit about that? Is the gap primarily about awareness, or is it willingness, or what were you thinking when you wrote that in your post?
So to be clear, I think there's still a lot that we don't know about a lot of animals, and I think sometimes we generalise what animals need, and actually all species are very different. But but I think there's a lot of information now out there about animal welfare. Animal welfare science has escalated, our understanding of it escalated in the last couple of decades. And we're so much more informed than we were 10 years ago, even, about the needs of animals overall, the inclination towards majority of animals likely being sentient, some of them having consciousness, and the realities of what that means in terms of them living their daily lives and how we should care for them if we're interacting with them or if we have some sort of oversight of them. And so this wonderful information that we have on animal welfare is often then not necessarily translated into practices within the zoo industry. And we're seeing a significant gap in, say, what an animal needs. So whether it's a binturong, which is a interesting Southeast Asian animal that smells of popcorn, or an orangutan or an otter, or just simply a hedgehog or an owl. And we know what they need, we're not providing it. And why is that? And I don't think there is any one answer to that, to be honest. If I could just say, oh, it's resources or it's culture or it's knowledge, brilliant, we can address that. It's not. It's very context relevant, so it may be very different in one area or region or country to another. And it's a combination, from my experience, of a lot of things. It's down to understanding knowledge, that informed approach. It's down to a cultural approach to how we treat animals. Obviously, for instance, in Thailand, it's very culturally appropriate or carried out to ride elephants. The mahout-elephant relationship goes back thousands of years. It's not carried out, say, in America or in the Western countries. And then you've also got your resources. A lot of zoos, despite what the public may think, are extremely under-resourced, don't necessarily have the staff capacity, but also the infrastructural capacity to provide that animal welfare. And I must add also, a lot of zoos are constrained by historic infrastructure. Some of them are built, a long time ago. And they've got these wonderful cages. And actually, London Zoo is a very good example. It's still got Victorian-style cages. Now, I must say that London Zoo don't use those. They go out of their way to make sure that they provide as a greater environment and living opportunities for animals as possible. But there's a lot of zoos around the world that actually try to mirror what London Zoo did in the Victorian times. They sort of built their facilities based on that design. And they don't have the ability to change that. They're constricted by space and infrastructure. So they're dealing with perhaps a bit more knowledge about animal welfare, but they can't actually apply it within the spaces that they've got. So there's multiple reasons, I think, that we're seeing this significant gap in some cases of what we know about animal welfare, but how then we're applying that animal welfare for animals in zoos.
And have you seen that gap close? Have you examples of places where things have actually changed, that this practice has caught up with the science?
Absolutely. In a lot of what I'll call modern zoos, there is a definite catch up of applied animal welfare to the science that we know. I think there's still restraints, and I remember one colleague in the zoo industry telling me they always had an enclosure or a cage of shame, and that essentially was an enclosure that they just couldn't change. But actually often that was because they had perhaps a geriatric and individual that wouldn't have benefited from being moved from that cage, but from the public's perspective it didn't look very good. But I'm seeing this in the modern zoo sector, absolutely. Not all, that's for sure. And I think some people can place themselves, zoos place themselves under that modern title and actually don't necessarily deserve that title. But I'm not necessarily seeing it in the vast majority of zoos, and I will add in aquariums there, because when I say zoos, I'm also talking about aquariums, anywhere where there's captive wild animals around the world. And I simply think that's because of the reasons I was mentioning before. There's multiple sort of different reasons as to why there is this gap.
Can you describe for an animal for us that you've seen where life went from living in perhaps quite impoverished conditions to one that's had their life transformed through a change in their living arrangements or maybe their handling or something like that? Because I think that would be fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, the one that springs to mind is my own personal experience. I do a lot of work in Japan with wonderful colleagues out there. And we were informed about 4 bears which are held in captivity over there. These 4 bears were in a very traditional museum, actually, about the traditional Ainu people in Japan, and they were there to describe how the Ainu people would look after the bears. And the public would come along, and it's very common in Japan for the public to feed the animals, but they throw food at the animals. They encourage the bears to beg for food. And these bears were in, at best, 4-metre by 4-metre enclosures, and they had been for 15 plus years, concrete floors. This is a really good example of where you cannot improve the situation there. But what you can do is you can work with those communities and the owners and the local authorities to identify a solution for those bears. And long story short, we secured the bears to be moved to a facility in the UK, which was a huge undertaking, and it wasn't something that we did lightly. We definitely originally looked to keep them in Japan, because it's not great to remove animals and say you can't look after them in Japan, we can look after them in the UK. That's not the message we wanted to deliver. And it was really important as part of that move that we brought in as many Japanese experts and stakeholders as possible, so that they were part of the solution and it wasn't against them. And so these bears were flown over to Japan, and that was a very interesting week of my career, where we were boxing up bears with DHL and flying them over to the UK, sorry. And they were put into a space which was about, I think it was around 4 acres, and or possibly even more actually, with a huge lake, infrastructure, climbing materials, and so on. Now, what was really interesting was originally the bears just didn't know what to do. They wouldn't come out. They were very scared, and they had also not been bears for the last however many years. They'd been begging entertainment animals, and they didn't know how to behave like bear. So it took a bit of time, and I think one of the most scary experiences for the staff at this particular facility were when the 2 male bears decided to go into the water, and bears do like to swim, and one of the bears submerged itself for about, I think they said minutes. I mean, who knows? They're probably potentially exaggerating. And they thought, oh my goodness, the bear's drowned itself. It doesn't know how to swim. But of course, animals do have natural instincts, and it all came flooding back to them, and they were just swimming in there to cool down. And these bears had then a wonderful experience of being provided the right diet, not just kibble, being provided the right healthcare, and being provided a facility space that they could carry out those natural and normal behaviours and live like bears and start thriving in life and not just surviving. And that's a common term that we use in the animal welfare field, of trying to allow an animal to thrive, not just survive. That for me obviously is quite an extreme example.
I'm just curious, how did the people go? Because I imagine, despite these bears not having particularly good welfare, I imagine there must have been bonds with these bears, with the people. How did they feel?
Yeah, absolutely. They cried on the day, but we'd had up to, I think, 18 months to 2 years of conversations with them about this. This wasn't something that we just tried to force on them within the next few months. And so they'd come to terms with it, and they understood they weren't going to get any more bears as well. But they did love these bears. And I think that's a really interesting sort of point to raise, is that there's often this confusion between loving an animal and providing it with good welfare. And we say, oh, but the animal's got good food, and we go and check on it daily, and we give it pats, and, you know, we interact with it and we love it. But actually, is that providing with them with the welfare needs that they specifically need, as in relation to their species, but also within relation to their individual needs? And quite often it's not. And we see this a lot in the pet industry as well, in the pet sector. I love my dog, but I keep him in an apartment for 23 and a half hours a day on his own, and I take him for a walk on a tight lead. But I love him very much. So, and it happens the same in the zoo world. But there is a way of translating that love into understanding and knowledge and compassion. And I think it's a great starting point, because you've got to be compassionate with something to want to understand it, and then that's when change happens.
I think that's so true. It's hard, isn't it, when you do love something to let it go. Or one of the things you mentioned in your post, which we will link to in the show notes, and just to give people a heads up, the post had a picture of I think it was a spider monkey, squirrel monkey tied to something in the foyer of a zoo. As entertainment for visitors as they came into the zoo. And so one of the things you mentioned was token enrichment and welfare washing. I think a lot of us are familiar with greenwashing. So with the phrase welfare washing, can you describe that and unpack that term a little bit for us?
I can try. It's a quite a big one to unpack. I mean, it's very similar in philosophy into the other washings, I suppose. And I think it can happen consciously and unconsciously as well. So essentially, it's the application of practices that may look good superficially, but actually don't achieve anything of substance when it comes to improving animal welfare. And as I say, consciously, that's where you are purposely carrying out, say, a welfare assessment, but you're just really ticking a box and you don't really want to do anything other than that. You're not going to apply the results necessarily, but you say that, look, we've carried out this assessment, we regularly assess the animal. Unconsciously, it may be where you're really making an effort and to try and provide environmental enrichment for that animal, but actually all you're doing is providing a bunch of quite boring toys that they immediately get bored with, and therefore it's not actually enriching their lives for any way or form. And unfortunately, and it's something that I've been dwelling on for a while now, I think, and it's not just exclusive at all to the zoo and aquarium sector by any means, but I think it is something that is happening on quite a large scale, because we're trying to show that we're carrying out good animal welfare, but actually not necessarily understanding what that really looks like. So that's where it's unconsciously happening, and we're ticking all those boxes of doing X, Y, Z, but really there's no real change in animal welfare. Or zoos and aquariums know that the public want to know that the animals are having good welfare, so they state certain things that they're doing. I think there's a real danger to it, because like any other washing sort of practice, it just appears like we're carrying out the right thing and we're doing the right thing, and it continues, but it means that animals continue to suffer under our care.
And I think that not only does it appear, people themselves, the caregivers, feel themselves that they are doing the right thing. So that's something you have to deal with as well. Absolutely.
And it's a really difficult one. And I remember an experience where I was sat down in a zoo overseas in Southeast Asia by an incredibly excited team of enrichment individuals, and they gave me I think it was a 10-minute video on all the enrichment that they'd done in the zoo, and they were so passionate about it, so excited, and every single enrichment they provided was completely useless. Enrichment really is about encouraging to carry out those natural normal behaviours for a sustained period, and those behaviours to be rewarding, being meaningful. But often what enrichment does is it just allows an animal to be active for 15 minutes. People go, look, it's doing something, it must be good. But if that behaviour is not meaningful or sustained, it's not enrichment.
I presume, zoos have a big role in education. I mean, I think we all think about zoos as somewhere where you bring your children primarily, or that's how it starts, to expose them to the wider world of animals and the different environments, the different habitats. And there's probably a role there, not just for the people who are being educated, or the children who visit, but for the keepers in terms of, explaining what they do, and maybe that's a way through to navigate that caring for and the welfare and the education. I just interested if that's something they do.
Again, there's so many different zoos around the world, and I'm going to talk on the ones that I mostly visit, which are the much, much poorer zoos. I don't believe they can be educational when you're seeing an animal in a very impoverished environment. Essentially, you're endorsing that animals are objects for us to view, and that we have a right to view them. Our right to view them trumps their right to a good life. And I don't believe that's true or should be acceptable. And a lot of these poorer zoos, I'll say, have visitor-animal interactions that encourage the touching of wildlife. Now, if you can touch a wild animal, that wild animal is generally going to be unhappy. There's very few wild animals out there that want to be touched by a human. And if they can be touched, it often means that they've been hand-raised, which again brings its own animal welfare issues. And the educational value of touching an animal, I'm not sure there's much in that. There's very little to demonstrate that we see significant change in people's behaviours when they visit a zoo. And I know there's other studies out there, and I can't speak on them because I'm not overly familiar with them, that do show that there is some change, definitely in the modern zoo when people go in and after they come out. Whether we can use that to justify the keeping of animals in zoos, I don't know. I think that's another very difficult philosophical question. But I do not see the educational value in the majority of the zoos that I have worked with overseas. Just by the very way that you're keeping an animal, a solitary elephant in a small enclosure, possibly weaving, possibly doing stereotypical behaviours because of the environment it's in, that's not educational. It's not telling you anything. And the irony is that you often see a sign outside the enclosure saying, these elephants live in big herds in Africa. They roam for miles and miles every day. They feed on X, Y, Z. And then you see this solitary elephant in the enclosure eating some hay. There's a disconnect there.
There definitely is. Yeah. And I'm kind of reflecting back. I don't go to zoos very often, but I'm reflecting back to times that I have, and I've definitely read those those things. And it's fascinating to think, oh my gosh, look, this animal lives in this environment and this is the sort of things that they like to do. And then, yes, there can be a very jarring disconnect.
I'm just thinking here about, you talk about the signs telling us about how far the elephants roam in the plains of Africa. Wouldn't it be great to get to a point where there'd also be signs explaining the behaviours that the public are seeing? That would kind of help make them realise that the animals are speaking to us through their behaviours. That would be a fabulous goal if that could happen.
I'm sure some zoos, modern zoos out there, do that and go into a lot more detail around the animal's behaviour. And also they talk about individual animals as well, and really understanding that individuals have different personalities like we all do. So it does happen, but then equally on the opposite side of the spectrum, you've got enclosures with no signs whatsoever. And I've seen plenty of those.
Is there sort of a push to sort of getting zoos to have fewer animals or fewer species even, so that they can provide a more rich environment that then is actually more enjoyable for the public to interact with or experience?
It's a great question. I do know of some zoos that are moving towards having more endemic species, so that they can really talk about the species that are in the country or in the region and really educate the public on those species. And I think that's a really exciting model, because people can think, well, they're around me as well. And there are light conversations around what species should actually be in zoos. And when I say light, unfortunately, there is still the favour of having as many different species as you can, and having a really wide collection of animals, because that's deemed most exciting for the public. Hence why you find solitary elephants in a zoo, because they want a big elephant. Next to them is 2 giraffes. Next to that is 1 lion, and so on. And sometimes it's quite often just up to the whim of the director. If they want those animals in, they get those animals in. I think it's a really valuable point, because I'd really love to see zoos and aquariums move in that direction, where they really consider, can we keep X, Y, Z in the space that we've got. If not, we don't keep them there. And we minimise the number of species but we've got, but we maximise how we can provide for them. We're still going to be restricted perhaps by that infrastructural design, but I think there would be better, easier ways to get around that when you've got fewer species in the zoo. And I certainly don't think the public would notice. Yes, they want to see a big elephant, or they want to see, the lions and the big exciting animals. But the more you educate them, and you then have space, for example, let's say for a squirrel monkey, where you can go into an enclosure where the squirrel monkeys are, and they're interacting not with you but around you. So you've got a big walk-through, say, squirrel monkey enclosure. That's so much more exciting for the children than looking at a bored lion. And I know that a lot of zoos do now. The really great ones that I work with do think like that and really try and maximise that. But unfortunately, the default is to have as many species as possible in zoos because they think that's what the public want.
I was chatting to someone today about the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone, and which I think many people would have come across, because it's just such a fascinating example of an ecology sort of springing back to life through one seemingly simple kind of change. Is any zoos trying to sort of create little ecologies within where they're sort of keeping species that would normally kind of be together?
I mean, in zoos they have mixed species exhibits, if that's what you're referring to, and they tend to work very well on the whole, because you've got those natural interactions that are happening between species that would naturally interact in the wild. The public tend to love these mixed species exhibits because it appears more natural as well. Zoos often do this with hoof stock, so they'll put a variety of different hoof stock, perhaps say from Africa, in a big large paddock enclosure, and it can look great. It can also look awful when there's too many of them and they're all fighting either for space or the feeding habitats. But I would champion those mixed species exhibits, definitely, where you can.
I suppose I've come to this from, Dublin Zoo would be our local zoo.
Yeah.
And I come to, so that's a first world zoo, I suppose. And you've worked in some very deprived zoos, and I'm just fascinated. You have obviously a huge passion that comes across, and I'm just wondering what drives Georgina to keep doing this, because I'm sure some of the situations you see, you just say, "Oh, I'm not sure if I can keep going." What keeps you going?
Oh, very good question, because sometimes I do wonder. And I have been in situations where I will admit, as a grown woman, I have burst into tears because it is really, really hard. But I also think if I didn't care it still, then actually I probably shouldn't be doing this. A lot of us talk about compassion fatigue in the animal welfare sector, and I'm sure you've come across that. And it is easy for me to potentially get that, and what I think then happens is I get a bit numb to what I'm seeing. I'm often asked, how do you go into these zoos and how do you work with these people, and how, when you're seeing this awful situation and you have to walk away often. And I have to almost sort of just see it very sort of methodically, that I am always going there in the hope that there will be change, in the hope that we will connect with these people, and perhaps not immediately, but sometime in the long term, there will be change for those animals. And I think that is what keeps me going. I just am incredibly passionate that zoos don't need to exist how they exist currently, or a lot of the zoos, I should say, and that there is a way forward, because some zoos are showing that there is that way forward. There is a different model. And if I'm not doing it, then who else is doing it? Yes, of course, there are other people, but actually there's not a huge amount within this space that address animal welfare at zoos, in captivity, I should say. Consistently. There's always that sort of either perhaps antagonistic campaigny approach, which I don't believe necessarily leads to much change, lobbying for, say, polar bears or elephants not to be in captivity, unless there are some solutions provided with that. And the approach that I've always taken, and certainly did with the organisation that I co-founded, Wild Welfare, was that we want to go in there with compassion for the people. And I think that's what keeps me going, really. I also meet some brilliant people in some awful zoos. So you can't judge a book by its cover, so to speak. I remember one in particular, again in Japan actually, awful zoo. Just dreadful. Every enclosure was just dreadful. And I met with the director, and she burst into tears because we were there, because she was so happy we were there, because she felt she had her hands tied. And I was sort of sitting there slightly in shock, because this director of the zoo was crying because she was happy I was there. And there was not much I could do at the time, really. It was very difficult. I'm now learning that zoo is actually being refurbished, and I'm really excited to hear about that and what it will look like. And I think refurbished very much from an animal enclosure perspective. So there are these wonderful people who want to have change, but they can't necessarily do it. Or there's some wonderful people who don't know that they want to have change, but once you chat with them, they go, oh, my goodness, that's exciting. So that, again, also keeps me going, I think, the people.
Yeah. One of the things that you mention in your post, just to sort of go back to that, is you sort of call for an embedded moral commitment rather than sort of a superficial application of care. So can you tell us what that looks like from an organisational level, and how do you know if a zoo has achieved that?
For me, it's about having everybody who works in the zoo, and we're not just talking about animal carers. There's a lot of people, from administrators to volunteers, to be wearing a welfare hat. That's a starting point. And what I mean by that is that everybody has that moral duty within their roles, within zoos, whether that's HR and who you're choosing to employ, whether that is the volunteers and how you're perhaps educating the public, is starting it from a very grounded, positive animal welfare perspective. And I don't see that often within zoos. Some may not have an animal welfare policy, which alludes to the fact that XYZ needs to happen, that there's a welfare culture within the zoo, but it doesn't translate into reality. And so for me, that moral duty that we have is making those difficult decisions, a bit like going back, Karen, to what you were saying about what animals should be in a zoo, really questioning whether morally they can look after that animal, that species, really questioning whether actually, with everything we know now about that species, should we really have them in captivity? And those are big and difficult decisions to be made, and I think they're also quite scary to be made, because they're not necessarily being made yet by the zoo world. And I do think that one day, when the first zoo or so steps out and says, this is what we're going to do, making those big, difficult moral decisions, ethical decisions as well, and setting a new precedence of how zoos could exist.
And you talked about meeting the people and developing a friendship and a relationship with the people. I presume that's at all levels of the zoo, wherever that zoo might be. And I'm just wondering whether you think that kind of moral commitment is more evident at the animal interaction level, with the keepers, or do you see it at the mid management level? Do you see it in the directors? And what's the most important for that change to happen?
I often see that it's the people who are doing the day-to-day care who are the ones who want the change the most. So they're the ones who are living and breathing with those animals and recognise those animals, whether they innately understand that animal is perhaps not happy, or whether they understand it from a more informed perspective. And time again, they come up to you and say, I really want to do this, but I'm not allowed, or I can't do this. And I see it less so in the director level, because they're more removed from the animals. They're more involved with the business side of the organisation or the facility, and they're not living and breathing the experiences with them. So for my role is to sort of bring that all together and try and encourage that moral duty in the higher ups perhaps of the zoos and aquariums, while providing opportunities for those that are doing the day-to-day grind with the animals, mucking out the animals, everything, that they're allowed to have a bit more autonomy of how they look after those animals. It brings me on, and I'm not sure if this is as it's relevant for you, but a lot of zoos are still very afraid of providing good animal welfare because it potentially there's a risk to the animal's well-being of health. So as an example, we don't want to provide them with a high up rope to swing from because they might fall from it, or we don't want to provide them with a whole carcass to feed from because they might choke on a bone or something like that. They're very basic examples. And so it takes a very health-centric approach to animal welfare rather than a more holistic approach, which is about their mental well-being as well. We see this across industries as well. How can we protect their welfare, their health and their physical well-being? And by doing that, we often minimise their physiological and psychological, well-being. And there's trying to meet in the middle where we can provide that more extensive management and allow those animals to have that autonomy and potential risk to their health, but their physical health, but still protecting their physical health as well to the degree that we can. And often it's the higher ups that don't want that risk to happen because they get their hands wrapped, where it's I call them the lower downs, and that's not doing them a good service, but the people who are working day in, day out who want to provide those animals with more autonomy. So there is that tension that we have to address as well.
Yeah, that's such a common story in the horse world, particularly because of the value of some of the horses involved in sport.
Yeah.
People just do not want to provide them with their needs for socialization and turnout and autonomy, freedom.
Yeah.
They're just because they'll be injured or they'll have a blemish or something that will devalue them for their needs.
Yep.
So it's that mindset is very, very prevalent within the horse world as well.
I think it's also because it's something we can understand as people. We can see a cut, we can see an injury, we can see that kind of thing. So we get it more. So I kind of get that with people day to day. Or I don't want him to go out, talking about horses, with 3 other horses because he might get kicked and then I've done a bad job of looking after him. But he might not get kicked and he might have a wonderful social time. And that's the balance. So I do get why people are hesitant. I really understand that because we understand those health-centric measures a lot more than the psychological and behavioural ones. And it's just getting over that hump for us when we care for animals, whether it's in the equine field or the zoo field.
Yeah.
I think we just have to get used to seeing our animals looking a bit scruffy, a bit like our kids, when the kid comes back from the park or been playing with their mates and they look a bit rough around the edges and maybe their clothes are torn a little bit, but they've had a great day.
They had a great... Absolutely, we do. We're so worried about, what the animals perhaps look like and, as I say, are they good weight or they've got a little cut on them. Do you know what? Sometimes it doesn't matter about those little minor injuries. Obviously, larger ones we want to be concerned about. And things do happen. There's always a risk. It's just balancing out that risk. And so that they have that opportunity, just as you say, like the kids, they can just go out and play. Animals do play as well. So yeah, it's the same in zoos. Absolutely.
So Changing Rein is about the horse industry. Do you see the common threads? Like we've just identified one in terms of health-centric focus that we have for their care. Do you see the similar issues across all the different animal use industries and in particular like the horse industry?
I think particularly, I have personal experience in the horse industry. I'm very fortunate to own an ex-racehorse. And I think I go back to that one about love and welfare. Certainly when you have a horse for non-perhaps commercial reasons and it's just your pet, so to speak, you love that horse and you want the best for that horse. But we're also stuck, like zoos, in often historic practices and historic infrastructure. We still just design those stables, and I'm sure you've talked about this plenty of times before. So there's that similarity in historic practices carrying on, because that's what we've always done and nothing's really gone wrong, so let's carry it on. Same with zoos. That we love our animals, but we don't necessarily provide them optimal welfare, but we love them, so that's enough. And it isn't. And we need to be distinguishing between loving our horse and making sure we bring him in when it's raining a little bit, and actually thinking, a horse doesn't mind rain, let's leave it out there. And the same with zoos. We love our animal. We're going to make sure that those animals have the best nutrition and they're not going to be risked from choking on a bone, so we're not going to give it whole carcass feeding. And then thinking about, well, actually, what does that species really need? And are we providing that? And I do think the equine industry is one of the probably worst when it comes to animal welfare, in terms of still carrying on those old historic practices. And I'm not quite sure how we overcome that, other than through continued sort of gentle pressure of looking into new ways of keeping animals, continued sort of expansion of those barn-like systems rather than stables, continued sort of expansive roaming of fields rather than contained within electric fencing, and so on. And the same goes for the zoos. It's sort of trialing those new ways, encouraging those new practices that perhaps would have been scary to begin with, but saying, look, let's give them a go. And trying to circumnavigate, I guess, the common problems that we have, but we sort of address them through. And a really good one with the equine world is weaving, where we used to just put up the triangular bars on the stable door. Exactly the same with the stereotypic behaviour in a zoo. We just, if it was pacing, we'd block that pace. We go, well, it can't pace anymore. That's not changing the animal's behaviour at all. It will just think of it or do it in a different way. So we're actually not addressing the core problem. So there's just so many parallels, because actually it's all just about us caring for an animal and having that moral duty that we should have when we're caring for that animal, whether it's a domestic species or whether it is a zoo animal. I will say one thing I think is very different in the farming sector, unfortunately. I think there is a long way to go until we improve our practices to a degree that is acceptable within that farming sector. And I think that's very much driven by the industry, unfortunately, and the demand, obviously, for the industry. So, yeah, there are differences, but there are a lot of similarities.
I think that's such a great place to sort of round out our conversation, Georgina. So, Georgina, in the Changing Rein studio, we have a genie, and the genie will grant you a wish. And so there's no constraints on your wish. So if you could have one wish that relates to animal welfare, it can be wild animals or horses, whatever it may be, what would it be?
I mean, the wish is enormous. So I because I couldn't focus it, but I just wish that, I mean, this is going to be a very, it's got to be a very impressive genie to get this one, but that no animal ever comes to harm by humans again in any industry or any sector. And if I can continue that wish, genie, that animals get to live out the lives that they want to lead just as much as we get to live out the lives that we want to lead. They are here and it's their only life that they ever know, and often we still just see them as products for us, yet that's their one life, and I want them to lead the life that they deserve. That would be my wish for every animal.
Oh, I think that's a wonderful wish.
It's a bit much, but the genie will have to work hard on that one. But
she will have to work very hard on that wish.
We don't normally follow up on the response to the genie question, but I'm just fascinated whether that in your mind means no human interaction or use of animals ultimately.
Really good question, and I don't think so. No, I think you can absolutely have wonderful positive interactions with animals, which actually improve both human and animal welfare. I really do, and I think in the equine world in particular, you can have a wonderful relationship with your horse. I hope my horse likes me. I'm not always sure. But we have some wonderful moments. The use of an animal is a difficult term. It depends on that use, and it depends whether that animal has some form of agency to be involved in that use. If it's just an interaction, can that animal choose not to be? Riding, are we convinced the animal is happy to be ridden? Some, as we know, horses absolutely love it, I believe. Some perhaps not. So I do think it is feasible for there to be a use, inverted commas, but I think that's such a that needs to be dissected so much more, because I do worry that we always believe that our right to use an animal and our right to see an animal and our right to interact with an animal does trump that animal's right to live its life. But that's an idealistic world, and we don't live in an idealistic world. It's not going to happen. So we need to find a place where we still feel comfortable living on this planet with animals in a way that we can all live a life that we want to live and thrive. That's how I see
And
it.
a life that is enriched in both directions. I mean,
In
that's
both directions, exactly. However long, however short that life is, it doesn't really matter in that respect, as long as it's lived that a good life during its life, really.
yeah, absolutely. Georgina, that's a great way to wrap up this this episode. I've really enjoyed it. I know some of our listeners say, what would we doing talking to someone from the wild welfare world? But I think by the end of it, they'll have realised that there's so many parallels between the world of captive animals and the horse world. So thank you very much for joining us on Changing Rein.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Changing Rein is brought to you by me, Karen Luke, and my co-host, Mita Osborne. If you enjoyed the show and would like to support us, please subscribe and leave us a review. It helps us keep the show going. You can watch this whole episode on YouTube at youtube.com/@changingrein. We love your suggestions, feedback, and questions, so please drop us a line. You can email us at team@changingrein.com. Thanks again for listening, and bye for now.